Practical, rugged, and relentlessly efficient. No banquets, no luxury, just fire, grain, and the stubborn will to keep marching. As soldiers stirred their pots under the stars, surrounded by the hum of thousands doing the same, they carried not only their kitchens, but the very rhythm of Rome's empire on their backs. A Roman soldier's life was measured in miles. Some days it was 20 kilometers, others 30, sometimes more if urgency demanded it. And through it all, the soldier carried not just weapons and armor, but also his sustenance, his rations on the march. The legion wasn't followed by endless carts of delicacies. It was an army designed to feed itself, to move fast, and to endure. Mobility was Rome's greatest weapon, and food discipline made it possible. The standard ration pack included grain, pork, cheese, and vinegar. But a soldier couldn't always cook while on the move. In those cases, the grain was parched, roasted over a quick flame to make it edible without grinding. It wasn't fine bread, but it kept hunger at bay. Hard cheese could be eaten straight, while strips of salted pork were gnawed on like jerky. Sometimes bread was baked in advance and hardened into biscuits, dense and dry, perfect for chewing during a march. This was food stripped of all ceremony, designed for endurance alone. The Roman army had a word for this discipline: frugality. They prided themselves on needing less than their enemies. While barbarian warriors might feast one day and starve the next, legionaries kept steady, each man carrying several days' worth of provisions in his pack. This made them unpredictable and dangerous. They could appear suddenly in enemy territory, unchained from fragile supply wagons because their kitchens were on their shoulders. Marching rations also shaped the culture of the legion. Eating on the move became part of the soldier's rhythm. Bite of bread, swig of puska, chew of pork. No luxury slowed them down. Even generals like Julius Caesar wrote about how his men could march faster and farther than rivals precisely because they knew how to ration properly. Hunger did not them. Discipline prevented it. Still, there were limits. When supplies ran low, men foraged. They plucked wild herbs, gathered fruits, or seized what they could from villages along the way. Some campaigns collapsed not from enemy swords, but from empty stomachs. For all Rome's logistics, the march was always a gamble, too slow, and the men might eat through their rations before the next resupply. Too fast, and exhaustion killed as surely as hunger. Yet, more often than not, the Roman legion succeeded. The very image of a soldier trudging along the dusty road, pack sagging with food, was the embodiment of Rome's secret weapon. Rations on the march weren't just survival, they were a strategy. For days on end, the legionaries' meals were predictable: grain, pork, cheese, and the sour bite of vinegar. But when victory came, food transformed from bare survival into celebration. The Roman feast after battle wasn't just about eating. It was about morale, reward, and reminding every soldier why enduring the monotony of rations was worth it. Feasting usually began when the fighting ended and the spoils were secured. The baggage animals, kept out of danger during the clash, were slaughtered first. Fresh meat replaced salted slabs, filling the camp with the smell of roasting beef, lamb, or goat. Soldiers who had choked down dried rations on the march suddenly tore into sizzling cuts, juices dripping onto their tunics. Wine, real wine, not the diluted sourness of puska, was uncorked, passed around, and drunk with abandon. For a night, the army shed its austerity and reveled. These celebrations served a deeper purpose. Victory feasts reinforced the bonds of the contubernium and the legion as a whole. Sitting shoulder to shoulder around fires, men who had survived battle together now toasted one another. The simple act of eating was transformed into a ritual. Meat roasted over shared flames, bread broken and passed, laughter rising above the embers. Even the most hardened centurion knew that food could heal what battle had broken. Commanders understood this too. Generals often distributed captured food as rewards, ensuring loyalty by filling bellies. A leader who shared spoils, whether it was grain from a conquered town or amphor of wine from seized stores, secured his men's devotion. Soldiers would forgive many hardships if they knew that victory promised feasting. The contrast was part of the magic. Hard bread and sour wine made the fresh meat and real wine taste all the sweeter. Legionaries joked that Rome's empire was built not just on discipline, but on the hope of a good feast after the killing stopped. These moments of indulgence were rare, but they lingered in memory, carried forward into the next grueling march. Yet even in celebration, moderation was expected. Discipline was never far from the table. Tomorrow might bring another battle, another march, and commanders feared that drunkenness could undo what victory had secured. So the feasts, though joyous, were bounded by order. Romans celebrated not as revelers, but as soldiers who knew duty would soon call again. For one night, though, the campfire was brighter, the food richer, and the laughter louder. In those fleeting hours, victory tasted not of vinegar and salt, but of triumph itself. When we think of Rome's conquests, we imagine gleaming swords, disciplined formations, and banners unfurled against foreign skies. Yet beneath the steel and spectacle lay something far more decisive: food. Rome's true weapon was not just the gladius, but the ability to feed its armies anywhere at any time for as long as needed. The empire wasn't built only on blood and stone. It was built on bread, pork, cheese, and vinegar. The genius of Roman logistics was that food was strategy. Legions didn't just fight, they carried the infrastructure of survival with them. Grain mills clattered in camp, portable kitchens fired up every evening, and supply lines stretched like veins across conquered lands. Enemies who relied on plunder or feasting quickly collapsed when campaigns dragged on. Rome, by contrast, could starve its foes into submission, not because its soldiers ate better, but because they ate consistently. Predictability beat plenty. Food also acted as propaganda. A soldier might endure weeks of monotony, but he knew his ration was guaranteed. 3 pounds of grain, salted pork, a measure of cheese, and the sour security of puska. That guarantee created loyalty. Generals who provided food earned trust. Those who failed saw mutiny. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan all understood that feeding the soldier was feeding the empire itself. To march without fear of hunger gave Rome an advantage that no enemy could easily counter. Beyond the battlefield, rations tied the soldier to the Roman identity. Eating the same simple diet day after day forged a sense of unity. A soldier from Gaul, another from Italy, and another from Syria might not share a language, but they shared bread from the same sack, pork from the same barrel, cheese hardened in the same sun. Food erased difference, shaping an army that thought of itself not as mercenaries, but as Romans. Even centuries later, when the empire strained under its own weight, food remained central. Shortages and disrupted supply lines often spelled disaster more than any barbarian spear. The collapse of Rome was as much about the breaking of its breadbasket as it was about the breaking of its borders. So when we picture the legions, we should remember this truth. Rome conquered because it could eat. Grain was the empire's lifeblood, salted pork its muscle, cheese its comfort, and vinegar its shield. Together, they marched farther than any weapon could. The Roman legion wasn't just a war machine, it was a mobile kitchen, and its provisions were as mighty as its swords. To step inside a Saxon hall was to step into the very heartbeat of the community. From the outside, these buildings seemed unremarkable. Long wooden halls built from timber, their roofs steeply thatched to shed rain, their walls sealed against wind. But inside they transformed into something greater than wood and straw. At the center of it all burned the hearth, a great fire that never seemed to die. Its flames cast dancing light across smoke-darkened beams, filling the hall with warmth, shadows, and the faint tang of ash in the air. The hearth wasn't merely a fireplace, it was a symbol of life itself. In a world where winters were long and the nights seemed endless, fire meant survival, but in the hall, it meant more. The hearth's glow drew people together, gathering warriors, lords, poets, and servants beneath one roof. It was here that communities found their strength, not on the battlefield or in the fields, but around the warmth of firelight. At night, the hearth transformed the hall into a theater of fellowship. Warriors returning from campaign sat shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, their mail glinting in the fire's glow. Their lord, seated at the high table, was illuminated not only by flame, but by the loyalty of those who pledged themselves to him. Around them, the room buzzed with life. Dogs dozed near the embers. Servants carried platters of food, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with the heavy sweetness of honeyed mee. The hall's design itself centered on the hearth. It was no accident that the fire sat in the middle of the space. Every conversation, every feast, every song circled around it. The hearth bound the room together just as it bound the people within. A Saxon warrior might see the flames as a reflection of his own life, fierce, fleeting, and sustained only by fuel. Without fire, the hall grew cold. Without loyalty, the community would falter. So when we speak of Saxon mee halls, we must first speak of their hearths. They were more than warmth against the chill. They were symbols of unity, loyalty, and endurance. In their glow, strangers became comrades, warriors became brothers, and a hall became a home. The feast was the heartbeat of the Saxon mee hall. More than a simple meal, it was a ritual that blended survival with ceremony, binding warriors and kin together through the act of eating. When the long tables were laid with roasted meats, steaming bowls of porridge, and loaves of coarse bread, the mee hall became something more than a shelter. It became the living symbol of unity. To feast in the hall was to be recognized. A warrior seated at the table had earned his place, whether through loyalty to his lord, valor in battle, or steadfast service to his kin. The distribution of food was never random. It was a subtle language of honor. A man who was given a generous cut of meat or a place closer to the Lord's high table knew he was respected. In contrast, a lesser warrior or a newcomer might find himself at the far end of the benches, his portion smaller, his status uncertain. The feast was as much about reinforcing hierarchy as it was about filling stomachs. Yet the mood of these gatherings was not cold or formal. The mee hall's atmosphere pulsed with life. The clatter of wooden trenches, the snapping of bones, the laughter of comrades echoing beneath the rafters. All of it gave the sense of belonging. Servants hurried between tables, pouring horn after horn of me, ensuring the drink of honey flowed as freely as the conversation. With every shared dish and every refilled cup, trust deepened. The feast also served as a stage for loyalty. Lords were expected to be generous, rewarding their warriors with not only food, but gifts of gold rings, weapons, or finely woven cloaks. In return, warriors pledged their continued service. This exchange of generosity and loyalty created a cycle that kept Saxon society stable. A feast wasn't just about food, it was about politics, economy, and survival. And in the warmth of the hall, with bellies full and spirits lifted, the harsh realities of life, raids, famine, endless toil, seemed a little farther away. For one night, the hall was a world apart, a place of abundance in a land often defined by scarcity. In Saxon culture, to eat together was to live together. Each feast strengthened the invisible bonds between men and their lord, between families and their community.
To be denied the feast was exile. To be welcomed at the table was life itself. Bread and meat filled the body, I filled the spirit. To the Saxons, I wasn't just a drink. It was liquid culture. The golden thread woven through every feast and gathering, brewed from honey, water, and sometimes herbs or spices. Mead carried with it the sweetness of summer fields and the labor of bees. In the mee hall, it became something greater, the drink of warriors, poets, and kings. The act of drinking was never solitary. Horns and cups were passed down the benches, each filled and refilled by servants who moved tirelessly through the smoky air. To raise a horn of mine was to share not only a beverage, but a bond. It was the taste of loyalty, fellowship, and the fragile peace of men who lived with war always at their doorstep. Mead encouraged laughter, loosened tongues, and gave courage to those who needed it. Under its influence, warriors told stories, poets recited sagas, and lords made promises that could shape the fate of their people. But I was more than a social lubricant. It carried symbolic weight. The honey it was made from was considered a gift of the gods, sacred and life-giving. Drinking me was, in a sense, partaking in that divine blessing. It was thought to bring wisdom, fertility, and strength. No wonder poets compared it to liquid gold. And warriors believed it fueled not only their bodies, but their courage on the battlefield. The communal aspect of drinking also reinforced hierarchy. The lord often received the first and finest horn, served ceremoniously by the cupbearer, often a woman of noble standing. This act was more than hospitality. It was a theater. Every eye watched as the lord raised his drink, his authority shimmering in the firelight. When he drank, he confirmed his place as the hall's protector and provider. When his warriors followed, they silently renewed their oaths of loyalty. Of course, there was a darker side. Too much of me could loosen tempers as easily as tongues. Feasts that began in harmony sometimes ended in brawls, with spilled drink and blood mixing on the floor. But even this chaos was part of the Mihal's life, a reminder that fellowship was fragile, maintained by both generosity and restraint. In the end, I was more than refreshed. It was memory in liquid form, a drink that captured loyalty, celebration, and the fleeting joy of life in a harsh world. To drink was to live, to remember, and to be remembered. At the head of every Mihal sat its master, the Saxon lord or Hufford, literally the giver of bread. His role was more than political. It was symbolic, spiritual, and deeply practical. The Mihal existed because of him, yet he was defined by how he conducted himself within it. His authority rested not only on the strength of his sword, but on the generosity of his hand. When warriors gathered in the hall, all eyes turned toward the high seat. The lord was expected to preside over the feast, to welcome allies, and to dispense both food and gifts. Rings of gold, fine weapons, and cloaks woven with foreign dyes were not mere luxuries. They were the currency of loyalty. To give was to bind. Each gift was a silent contract. In return for generosity, the warrior owed service, courage, and unswerving loyalty in battle. This generosity was more than show. In a society where wealth came from land, cattle, and plunder, redistribution kept power stable. A greedy lord who hoarded treasures soon found himself without followers. A generous lord, by contrast, could transform even modest wealth into enduring loyalty. The Mihal was his stage. In every gesture, whether pouring the first horn of me or offering a carved sword, was part of the drama of leadership. The lord was also the hall's protector. It was his duty to ensure that those who feasted beneath his roof were safe, that no enemy breached its doors, and that the hearth fire never went out. The hall's glow symbolized his strength. As long as it burned, his people knew they were secure. Stories recited by poets often praised lords not only for victories in war, but for the warmth and abundance they provided in the hall.
Yet this role came with weight. A lord who failed to provide food, drink, or protection risked losing his warriors' loyalty. Betrayal in the hall could be as fatal as betrayal in battle. To preside poorly was to weaken the bonds that held the community together. In the end, the Saxon lord was as much a host as a warrior. His hall was not simply a dwelling, but a living symbol of his ability to give, protect, and lead. In the firelight, with warriors feasting at his table, his power was visible, not in isolation, but in the loyalty that surrounded him. If the lord was the anchor of the Mihal, then the poets were its voice. Known as scops or bards, these men carried more than songs. They carried memory itself. In a culture without books or written records, stories were the threads that bound the past to the present, ensuring that warriors' deeds did not vanish into silence. The Mihal, smoky and warm with firelight, became their stage. When a poet stood, horn in hand, the hall hushed. His words could transport warriors back to ancient battles, to the deeds of ancestors who fought giants, dragons, and rival kings. These weren't just tales. They were lessons. Through rhythm and rhyme, the scop taught loyalty, warned against betrayal, and praised the noble virtues of courage, generosity, and honor. A well-oiled saga was as important as any weapon, shaping how men saw themselves and their place in the world. Storytelling in the Mee Hall also elevated warriors to near immortality. A man might die in battle, but if the poet sang of his bravery, his name lived on, echoing through the rafters for generations. To be forgotten was true death. To be remembered was glory. Warriors often fought not just for land or loot, but for the promise that the scop would one day sing of them beneath the glow of the hearth. The content of these performances ranged widely. Some were heroic epics, recounting mighty battles. Others were elegy, lamenting loss and the fleeting nature of life. Still others carried humor or satire, poking fun at rivals or even lords who failed their duties. In every case, the poet wielded power. His tongue could praise or shame, build reputations or tear them down. Often music accompanied the poetry. A harp or lyre provided a steady rhythm underscoring the cadence of the words. The hall became a symphony of fire crackling, warriors murmuring, and strings resonating beneath the voice of the bard. In these moments, the Mee Hall was not only a place of feasting, but of culture. A school without walls, a theater without a stage. The poet's role was essential. He ensured that victories were remembered, defeats explained, and the values of the community reaffirmed. In the Saxon world, where memory was fragile and death always near, the voice of the storyteller was the closest thing to eternity. The Saxon Mee Hall was not only a place of feasting and storytelling, it was also a courtroom of loyalty where bonds between lord and warrior were forged and renewed. Here, under the gaze of firelight and with the taste of me on their lips, men swore oaths that bound their lives to their leaders. These were not casual promises. In a world where treachery meant ruin, an oath in the hall was sacred, sealed before both comrades and gods. At the heart of this system was the comitatus, the warrior band. Each man pledged himself to his lord, promising courage in battle and faithfulness in peace. In return, the lord swore to provide protection, food, and reward. The Mee Hall gave this bond its stage. When a warrior lifted his horn and declared his loyalty, it was not just to the lord sitting at the high table. It was to every man in the hall who heard him. Breaking such an oath brought not only disgrace but exile. The rituals were steeped in symbolism. Warriors often swore with hands placed on weapons, invoking the steel they would wield for their lord. Some touched the communal mayhorn as they spoke, linking their oath to the drink that united the hall. The presence of poets ensured that these vows were remembered. A man who pledged boldly in the hall but failed to act bravely on the battlefield could expect to hear his cowardice sung of in mocking verse for years to come. Loyalty was also reciprocal. A good lord publicly acknowledged his men's oaths with gifts, rings, swords, shields, or cloaks. These were not bribes, but symbols of trust, visible proof that the warrior was part of his lord's household. The more generous the lord, the stronger the loyalty he commanded. In this exchange, the Mee Hall became both courtroom and treasury, where promises were forged in drink, memory, and wealth. Yet the oaths went beyond politics. They bound lives together. A warrior's promise meant he would not abandon his comrades, even if death came. Tales told in the hall celebrated not only victories, but the steadfastness of men who died beside their lords rather than flee. Such stories reinforced the hall's central lesson. Loyalty was worth more than life. Thus, the Saxon Mee Hall was more than a place of warmth and me. It was the crucible of trust, where words carried the weight of blood and oaths, echoed louder than the crackling of the hearth fire. Though mead halls are often remembered as the domain of warriors and lords, women played a vital role within their smoky rafters. They were not merely background figures, their presence shaped the tone, ritual, and very meaning of the hall. The cupbearer, often the wife, daughter, or trusted kinswoman of the Lord, was central to the life of the feast. Carrying the great horn of meat from man to man, she moved with dignity and care, ensuring each warrior drank in turn. This ritual was not simply about serving. It was about order, hierarchy, and respect. To receive the horn from her hands was to be recognized as part of the fellowship. Her role symbolized peace in a world dominated by violence. A woman's movement through the hall softened the edge of rivalry, reminding warriors that loyalty was as much about community as it was about bloodshed. She embodied continuity, linking households together through marriage, kinship, and ritual. In many stories, the moment a queen or noblewoman presented the meat cup was when alliances were confirmed, oaths renewed, and tension dissolved. Her gestures carried political weight equal to any sword. Women were also keepers of memory. While male poets recited heroic deeds, women were often the mourers, their voices carrying laments that reminded men of the cost of war. Their songs, quieter but no less powerful, ensured that loss was remembered alongside victory. This duality, celebration from poets, sorrow from women, balanced the emotional life of the hall. Some women held influence beyond ritual. A powerful lady might act as counselor to her lord, whispering advice in private but reinforcing it in public through her ritual duties. Her presence in the hall reminded warriors that leadership was not solitary. It was sustained by household and kin. In this way, the Me Hall became not just a fortress of warriors, but the heart of an extended family. And of course, women were symbols of continuity. While warriors might die in foreign fields, women carried forward lineages, ensuring the survival of families and tribes. Their presence at the feast was a reminder that loyalty was not only to a lord, but to future generations. Thus, though the May Hall's songs often glorified the clash of swords, it was the quiet, steady presence of women, cupbearers, mourners, and counselors that gave the hall its deeper humanity. Without them, the fellowship of warriors risked becoming only noise and blood. The Saxon Mee Hall was more than a roof over heads. It was architecture with meaning, built to embody belonging and power. From the outside, the hall might appear simple. A long wooden building, its thatched roof pitched steeply against the rain, smoke curling from gaps in the beams. But step inside, and its design revealed its true purpose: to gather, to unify, and to impress. The hall's shape was deliberate, long and rectangular, with benches running down its length. It naturally directed all eyes toward the high seat at the far end. There, elevated above the rest, the Lord presided, the hearth fire's glow dancing across his face. This arrangement was no accident. It placed hierarchy into the very bones of the building. The physical space mirrored the social order. Lord at the head, warriors ranked along the sides, servants and newcomers toward the edges. Every plank and beam reinforced who belonged where. At the center burned the hearth, the hall's true heart, positioned so its smoke rose through the roof's opening. It lit and warmed the entire space, but it was more than practical. The hearth symbolized community itself, the fire around which people gathered, the light that pushed back darkness. No corner of the hall was untouched by its glow. To sit in its warmth was to be part of the whole. To be outside was to be forgotten. The architecture also amplified experience. The high ceilings carried sound, making the clash of laughter, song, and poetry echo grandly. Rafters darkened by smoke became canvases for memory, each stain a reminder of years of feasting. Carved posts and decorated beams sometimes displayed patterns of beasts or knots, linking the structure to myth and tradition. The hall was not just built, it was inscribed with identity. Importantly, the Mee Hall was a communal space, not private property. Unlike the Lord's sleeping chamber or a warrior's tent, it belonged to everyone who had earned a place within it. Its architecture invited participation. Long tables for shared meals, benches for collective sitting, open space for poetry and storytelling. It was designed to erase isolation, to make each man feel part of a larger brotherhood. Thus, the hall was not only timber and thatch, it was a building that spoke. Its walls reminded warriors of loyalty, its hearth of unity, its high seat of authority. To cross its threshold was to step into belonging, to know one's place within a community bound by firelight and fellowship. Though the smoke of Saxon hearths has long since faded, the Mee Hall's legacy lingers in story, language, and cultural memory. These wooden halls, once filled with the laughter of warriors and the drone of poets, were not merely buildings. They were symbols of identity. They represented the center of community life, the place where power was displayed, loyalty sworn, and memory preserved. Even after their timbers rotted, their echoes survived in legend. Epic poems like Beowulf immortalized the Mead Hall as the stage for both celebration and conflict. Hrothgar's Herod, the Hall of the Heart, stands as an archetype, golden, bright, and alive with song until threatened by the monster Grendel. The hall in these tales is more than backdrop. It is character. Its fall or survival mirrors the fate of its people. The Saxons may not have written much themselves, but their descendants preserved the image of the Mee Hall as a cultural heart. The hall's influence also shaped medieval concepts of kingship and hospitality. Later, great halls of Norman and English castles carried forward the tradition. High tables, central hearths, communal feasting. Even today, when we picture medieval banquets, we unconsciously trace the Saxon model. The idea that a ruler proves his worth by feeding and rewarding followers is an inheritance from those smoky timber halls. The Mee Hall's legacy lies not only in architecture or ritual, but in values. It embodied the balance of generosity and loyalty, of storytelling and memory. Warriors sought glory, but it was the hall that guaranteed remembrance. Poets sang of deeds. Women passed the horn. Lords gave gifts, all within walls that bound the community into one. The Saxon Mee Hall taught that belonging is built not on stone, but on shared ritual. Even modern notions of fellowship, whether in clubs, taverns, or even the idea of a common room, owe something to this heritage. The glow of fire, the sharing of drink, the telling of stories. These are ancient rhythms that continue to define how humans bond. The Mee Hall may have been unique to its time, but the longing it fulfilled. Warmth, kinship, remembrance is timeless. In the end, the legacy of the Saxon Mee Hall is not its timber or thatch, but its spirit. Wherever people gather around a fire, lift a drink, and tell stories to remember who they are, the old halls live again. For the Saxons, time was not measured in neat rows of ink on parchment, but in the steady heartbeat of the natural world. The rise of the sun, the fall of the moon, the greening of fields, and the withering of leaves, all told them what the calendar could not. Life was bound to cycles of sowing and harvest, of cold and warmth, of hunger and plenty, and at each crucial moment of these cycles, the Saxons gathered in ritual and feast, marking their place in the great wheel of the year. These gatherings were not frivolous distractions from hard work. They were the glue that bound community together. In a world without certainty, festivals gave rhythm and reassurance. The harsh winter nights, when frost gnawed at doors and the sun seemed reluctant to return, were answered by blazing fires and shared meal. The restless days of spring, when fields demanded planting and warriors sharpened their spears, were marked by rites that blessed fertility and promised renewal. Even harvest itself, exhausting as it was, ended in celebration. A reminder that toil bore fruit and the community would endure another year. Religion lay at the heart of these cycles. Pagan gods and ancestral spirits were honored at feasts with offerings of grain, meat, and drink. Fires symbolized the rebirth of the sun, while songs carried prayers for good fortune and safety in battle. To participate in a festival was to participate in the sacred order of things, a reminder that man's work on earth was tied to forces greater than himself. Yet these events were not all solemnity. They were also occasions of joy, laughter, and abundance in lives that were otherwise marked by hardship. Tables filled with roasted meats, horns of meat passed from hand to hand, and music echoed through the halls. People sang, danced, and told stories that stitched the community together. The festival was a rare moment when hunger gave way to plenty, fear to hope, isolation to belonging. For the Saxons, then the year was not a straight line, but a circle. Each festival turned the wheel, marking both an ending and a beginning. Through fire, food, and fellowship, the Saxons not only survived the seasons, they gave them meaning. When winter pressed hardest, when the night stretched long and the earth seemed lifeless, the Saxons turned to Uli. This mid-winter festival was more than a holiday. It was an act of defiance against the cold and dark. The people lit great bonfires, some in open fields, others in the hearths of mee-halls, flames leaping high as if to call back the sun itself. Fire was not just warmth. It was a promise, a living symbol that light would return and that life had not been abandoned by the gods. Ul was marked by abundance, though it came in the leanest time of year. Families gathered in halls heavy with the smell of roasting meats, pork, venison, or whatever the hunters could bring in. Bread was baked, ale brewed, and most importantly, the drinking horns of mee flowed without end. The sharing of food and drink in such difficult months was no small thing. It reinforced solidarity. No one faced the long night alone. If your lord filled your plate and horn at Ula, he was not just feeding you. He was proving his worth as a provider, the one who could lead you safely through scarcity. The religious element was inseparable. Ula fires honored the gods and spirits of the ancestors, calling for protection through the dangerous winter months. Offerings of food and drink were cast into the flames, smoke rising as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Warriors often used this time to boast of past deeds or swear new oaths, the fire itself serving as witness to their pledges. Just as the sun would return after its darkest hour, so too would loyalty endure after the trials of war. It was also a time of inversion when the ordinary rules of life relaxed. Stories tell of games, contests, and mischief with laughter filling the smoke-filled halls. Ula was not merely a pause from hardship. It was a celebration of survival. Children received gifts carved from wood or bone, tokens of joy to brighten the darkest season. Above all, Ula reminded the Saxons that even in the depth of winter, life still pulsed. Fire blazed, drink warmed, and fellowship held firm. In that glow, they saw not only the end of one year, but the birth of another, a cycle unbroken. If Ula was about survival in the dark, spring festivals were about renewal in the light. As the frost loosened its grip and the first shoots broke through the soil, the Saxons turned to rituals of fertility. Celebrations that honored the earth's awakening and called upon the gods to bless fields, herds, and families with abundance. In a world where one failed harvest could mean starvation, these rites were not quaint superstition. They were urgent acts of hope. The season's rituals often centered on the goddess Iostra, whose name lingers in our word Easter. She was associated with dawn, rebirth, and fertility, her symbols tied to hares, eggs, and the returning sun. Offerings of bread, milk, and honey were made in her honor, placed on altars or buried in the earth as gifts to ensure the land's generosity. Fires were lit at dawn, their smoke curling skyward like prayers for good harvests. Communal feasting was an essential part of these spring rites. Fresh lamb and early greens often marked the tables along with the last reserves of stored grain. Eating together symbolized shared renewal. The community would not only survive the winter but flourish in the year ahead. Mead horns circulated and songs filled the air, many of them celebrating fertility not only in fields but in families. Weddings and betrothals often coincided with these festivals, binding human unions to the earth's own cycles of rebirth. The rites themselves could be playful as well as sacred. Young men and women participated in games that carried symbolic meaning, races, dances, and contests of strength that mirrored the vigor of new life. Some traditions involved scattering ashes or blessing fields with fire and water, rituals meant to cleanse and fertilize the soil. Every act, whether solemn or spirited, carried the same message. Life returns, and with it the promise of abundance. For warriors, spring rites had their own weight. The season marked the start of campaigning when roads and fields were clear enough for armies to move. Oaths taken during fertility rites bound warriors to their lords as firmly as the plows bound farmers to their soil. Thus, spring was both a season of crops and of conflict. Its rituals shaped not just the year's food, but the year's battles. Spring fertility festivals reminded the Saxons that life was fragile yet resilient. Every seed stubble was an act of faith. Every rite is a declaration that death and darkness would not have the final word. If spring was about hope and sowing, the harvest festival was about proof and reward. After months of toil in the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, and praying, the Saxons marked the season of reaping with one of their most important celebrations. The harvest feast was both thanksgiving and survival strategy, a moment when the community could finally see the fruits of their labor piled high before them. The timing varied with the crops, but late summer and early autumn were the busiest months. Barley, oats, wheat, and rye were gathered along with fruits from orchards and whatever livestock could be called for winter stores. Fields that had once been bare now yielded bounty, and the mead hall tables groaned with roasted meats, loaves of fresh bread, and bowls of grain porridge made from the new harvest. Ale brewed from the fresh barley, and honey-rich mead marked the occasion with a drink as golden as the fields themselves. But the feast was not only about filling bellies, it was steeped in ritual. The first sheath of grain was often dedicated to the gods, sometimes set aside in a place of honor or burned as an offering. This act symbolized gratitude and acknowledged that abundance came not by human hands alone, but by divine favor. The harvest feast was as much about appeasing unseen powers as it was about enjoying the visible bounty. The celebration also reinforced community bonds. Everyone from lords and warriors to farmers, craftsmen, and children shared in the feast. For one night, differences of rank softened, replaced by the shared relief that the stores were full and the winter would be endured. Songs praised not only the gods, but the labor of men and women who had bent their backs in the fields. Dances often followed, their steps echoing the rhythms of planting and reaping, turning hard labor into art. For the Lord, the harvest feast was a moment of generosity. To distribute food and drink freely was to prove his role as protector and provider. To withhold would be shameful. Abundance was expected. Gifts might even be given, tokens of gratitude for loyal service during the hard months. The harvest feast was not only a marker of survival, it was a declaration of continuity. Each year's bounty carried the promise of another cycle, another turning of the great wheel of seasons. In a land where famine always lurked, this festival was both relief and renewal, a reminder that toil and faith could indeed bring reward. Not all Saxon feasts were tied to the soil. Some were born of blood and steel. When war bands returned from raids or campaigns, victorious or merely surviving, the Emmy Hall became the stage for their triumph. These were not quiet suppers, but roaring victory feasts where warriors' deeds were praised, loot was divided, and loyalty between lord and men was reaffirmed in food, drink, and ritual. The feast often began with a display. Weapons taken from enemies, captured banners, or exotic goods from distant lands were paraded before the gathered crowd. Warriors seated at the benches waited for their share. Sometimes silver, sometimes livestock, sometimes even slaves or jewelry. Yet the greatest rewards were often symbolic. a lord presenting a warrior with a new sword or ring in front of his peers. To receive such a gift during the feast was to be publicly honored, your courage enshrined in memory. Food and drink flowed as freely as the boasting. Roasted meats, sometimes the spoils of the raid itself, were piled high, and horns of me were never empty. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, song, and the inevitable contests of words. Warriors would boast of their victories, sometimes truthfully, sometimes with exaggeration, while poets recorded their words in song. These boasts were not idle bragging. They were a kind of currency, a way to establish honor and demand recognition. The victory feast was also a political act. By distributing spoils, the Lord proved his generosity. By rewarding bravery, he secured loyalty. A lord who was stingy or forgetful during such a feast risked losing the respect of his warriors, perhaps even their service. In contrast, a generous feast could ensure loyalty for years. It was no accident that lords often planned the most lavish celebrations after successful campaigns. The hall itself became a battlefield where loyalty was won, not with swords, but with bread and me. These feasts also carried ritual weight. Oaths of loyalty might be renewed, sometimes dramatically, with warriors swearing on their weapons or raising their horns in solemn pledges. The poet's verses immortalized these moments, ensuring that glory would not fade with the dying fire. For the Saxons, victory feasts transformed violence into order. Bloodshed outside became fellowship inside. The hall turned the chaos of war into the structure of loyalty, weaving courage into community through fire, food, and story. For the Saxons, feasting was never only about survival or celebration, it was also sacred. At certain times of the year, food and drink became offerings, bridging the human world with the divine. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting tied the community not only to one another, but to their gods, ancestors, and the unseen forces that governed fate. The most common sacrifices were animals. Cattle, sheep, or swine were offered during great festivals. Their blood spilled as a gift to the gods of harvest, war, or fertility. The act was solemn, often accompanied by prayers, chants, or the lighting of ritual fires. Yet the sacrifice was not wasteful. After the gods were honored, the meat was roasted and shared among the people. This practice blurred the line between offering and feast. To eat the sacrificed animal was to take part in the blessing, to consume both nourishment and divine favor. These sacred feasts often took place in the me hall, but sometimes they were held outdoors at sacred groves or stone sites. Fires were lit, food prepared, and horns of me raised in toasts to deities such as Woden, Thunor, or Frigr. Each toast was both prayer and promise, asking for protection in war, fertility for the fields, or good fortune for the coming season. In this way, every bite and every sip became an act of devotion. The role of the Lord during these feasts was crucial. He acted as both host and priest, guiding the rituals and ensuring the offerings were made correctly. His ability to connect his people with the divine reinforced his authority. A Lord who led the feast well showed not only generosity, but spiritual power. His rule was sanctified by fire, food, and the gods themselves. Yet these occasions were not only solemn. Sacred feasts were also communal celebrations. After the sacrifices were made, the atmosphere often shifted to joy. Music swelled, storytellers performed, and the people feasted deep into the night. For the Saxons, piety and pleasure were not opposites, they were partners. To honor the gods was to celebrate life, and to celebrate life was to honor the gods. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting reminded the Saxons that survival was never a human achievement alone. The gods provided, the ancestors watched, and the people responded with gratitude, offerings, and joy. In those moments, the line between the mortal and the divine blurred, and the hall glowed with more than firelight, it glowed with blessing. No Saxon festival was complete without entertainment. Once the sacrifices were made, the feasting done. And the me-flowing, the hall or village green transformed into a stage of laughter, competition, and music. Games, music, and merriment were more than diversions. They were rituals of joy, a way to bind communities through play as much as through prayer. The games varied with the season. In spring and summer, when the weather allowed, athletic contests dominated. Wrestling matches tested strength, while spear throwing and archery displayed martial skill. Young warriors proved themselves before their elders, earning admiration and sometimes mockery if they fell short. These contests were not idle sports, but training for battle disguised as entertainment. Victory brought prestige and losing built resilience. The community watched, cheered, and remembered. Winter games were often played indoors within the warmth of the hall. Dice, knucklebones, and board games such as raffle filled the long nights, their clatter echoing beneath the rafters. These games mixed chance with strategy, echoing the Saxon view of life. Fate ruled all, but skill still mattered. Laughter and groans at the fall of dice reminded everyone that luck was as much a player as any man. Music carried equal weight. Harps, lyres, and drums provided rhythm for songs that could stir hearts or soothe weary souls. Skilled musicians could lift the hall into a frenzy or silence it into reverence. Poets and bards recited tales of gods, kings, and heroes, weaving entertainment with cultural memory. To hear one's ancestors honored in verse was as sweet as me, and to have one's own deeds sung was to taste immortality. Dance, too, filled the spaces between contests and songs. Men and women moved in circles, stamping feet and clapping hands, their motions echoing the cycles of nature and the rhythm of community. Children ran between the dancers, mimicking their steps, already learning the traditions that would one day be theirs to keep alive. But perhaps the greatest mirth was simply the laughter. Festivals allowed space for humor, for jesters, and fools to mock even the highest lord. Their antics were tolerated in the spirit of release. In a world of hard work, hunger, and danger, these moments of levity were essential. They reminded the Saxons that life was not only duty and survival, but also joy. Through games, music, and merriment, festivals balanced the sacred with the playful. They turned survival into celebration, making the bonds of fellowship stronger with every laugh, song, and contest. For the Saxons, festivals were not isolated events, but markers on the great wheel of the year. Each celebration announced a turning point in the cycle of nature, guiding people through darkness and light, scarcity and abundance. Unlike our modern calendars, where dates are abstract numbers, the Saxons lived by rhythms they could see and feel. The thaw of the earth, the height of the sun, the shortening of days. Every feast was both an ending and a beginning. Winter ended with Ule, when fire and me pushed back the cold and called for the return of light. From there, the cycle turned towards spring fertility rites, which celebrated planting, rebirth, and hope. These were not just rituals of survival, but statements of faith. That seeds buried in the soil would rise, that life would outlast death, that the gods would not abandon their people. Summer brought its own gatherings, often tied to midsummer fires. These flames honored the longest day of the year, a reminder of the sun's power and a plea that it lingered long enough to ripen crops. Summer festivals were times of strength, when warriors prepared for raids and fields brimmed with promise. Then came autumn, the season of harvest, when the feast tables overflowed and relief spread through every household. The turning of the seasons was not only agricultural, but spiritual. Each shift reminded the Saxons of weird, the concept of fate. Just as the seasons could not be stopped, so too were human lives bound to a greater order. Festivals gave people a chance to accept that fate, to honor the cycles that ruled them, and to find comfort in their predictability. Communities experienced these changes together. A poor harvest was everyone's hardship, a successful one, everyone's joy. Festivals made the turning of the seasons communal rather than solitary, binding families and clans in the shared acknowledgement that they were subject to the same sun, the same soil, the same gods. In this way, the Mayhall fire was more than warmth, the feast more than food, the song more than entertainment. Each celebration was a ritual of transition, a way of walking through the doors of time together. The Saxons did not just observe the turning of the seasons, they lived inside it. Their lives are as cyclical as the festivals that marked them. Though the smoke of their hearths has long since drifted away, the spirit of Saxon festivals still lingers in the traditions we recognize today. What began as communal fires in wooden halls and offerings of meat to the gods left echoes in later medieval feasts, church holidays, and even the rhythms of our modern calendar. The Saxons may be gone, but their cycle of celebration remains woven into culture. Take Ula, for example. Its fires and feasts survive in Christmas traditions.